All right. Well, good morning, everybody. It really is a pleasure to be here, and I want to start off with a really hearty thanks to Colleen, and the people at the center who've been incredibly hospitable and welcoming. For those of you who don't know a lot about the Fulbright program, it's sort of jointly run by the Canadian and U.S. governments. I had lunch with a representative of the U.S. Embassy yesterday, and she said, the University of Ottawa is known for treating its Fulbrights incredibly well, and that has certainly been my experience. And even though the center is new, its sort of academic reputation preceded it. So I'm really honored to be affiliated with it, and hopefully the talk today will be consistent with the high standards that I know that it has for its researchers. So I'll be talking about intellectual property, global health, and the new international economic order. And the central argument is that a series of international health agreements formed between 1981 and today have effectively carried on the agenda of the new international economic order. So in many ways, my talk today is about both global inequality and global health. And I hope that prompts a sort of a rich discussion about the overlap between the two. But because it's about inequality, that's sort of where I'm going to start. These are two charts, one of which shows the ratio of richest to poorest countries in the world, and one of which shows when global inequality really steepened and how it's maintained over the course of the 20th century. What you might notice about both charts is that the substantial increase in both of those metrics occurred during the peak of global colonization. So that was the forceful or typically forceful control over territory and populations by primarily European countries. The United States was also a colonial power, not in the same way, but certainly with respect to the Philippines and Caribbean possessions, a lot of the conduct will be similar. And I don't know that I really need to remind an educated crowd like this one about where these empires were and where they were run from. So the British Empire over substantial parts of the world. The French Empire in blue was the empire sort of immediately pre-World War II, the green sort of more historical possessions, the Spanish Empire in red, and the Portuguese Empire in red as well. So over this period, which really reached its peak at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, you had more or less European control over vast territories and populations in the world. What's typically peripheral to conversations about colonialism is that it was at the peak of colonialism that the modern era of international intellectual property law really began. And that's important because the conversations that were going on in European countries at the time that major treaties were formed were actually quite contested and divisive. So in the United Kingdom, for example, which we would now regard as quite a strong and robust promoter of intellectual property rights worldwide, newspapers, parliamentarians, economists were all divided on whether things like patents were in fact pernicious to the development of industrial policy. That is, giving people monopolies or market exclusivities as a reward for their inventions or for their creative works. Switzerland had a similar divide. Holland didn't allow patents until the early part of the 20th century. Bismarck opposed patents when he led Prussia, and then as the leader of the German Federation eventually lost that sort of conversation to the Society of German Engineers. So the question is, if there was so much resistance to strong intellectual property rights in European countries in the 19th century, how did they become so strong as colonialism peaked? And the answer, I argue, is that at the same time that conversation was going on domestically, these constituencies, large global corporations, more or less in their present form, had really started to become influential players. And the entry and maintenance of markets required them to be able to sort of go to more countries and have their patents and trademarks and industrial designs protected. When we think of the Berne Convention, to those of you who know it, when you think of these people like Dickens and Victor Hugo, who argued that their works were being pirated, the reality is that the constituencies who were pressing the development of these treaties were the publishing houses, which were making, as they do now, much more money than the authors do. So these constituencies managed to successfully argue to their foreign ministries that national interests would be promoted by strong intellectual property rights. And they explicitly used the language of colonialism to do so, right? So according to these constituencies, civilized people protected patents. Civilized people gave rights to authors to control the reproduction of their works. It was reminiscent of the same language used to justify the domination by white Europeans in Africa and Asia. Of course, after World War II, decolonization swept the globe. You had an increasing number of nation states that were members of the United Nations, particularly the United Nations General Assembly, and you had populations that were illiterate, that were poor, and you had economies that by virtue of colonialism had been organized to export one, maybe two commodities, right? So ground nuts from Malawi, cotton from Burkina Faso, sugar from the Dominican Republic. And those countries, as a lot of you know, made explicit calls from wealthier countries to essentially make good on what they had taken from them. And we typically refer to that set of demands as the new international economic order. So that phrase, the new international economic order, symbolizes lots of different things, but I think that we can agree at the very minimum it meant that developing countries, or at the request of their host governments, would be able to control global corporations and their foreign direct investment activities. So over the course of the 1950s and 1960s, you had really pretty heavy-handed interventions by corporations in some countries to protect their markets, including the sponsoring of military coup. The ability to establish producer cartels, so for the kinds of countries that I just mentioned, where you had one sort of commodity that you could export, after decolonization, there is a tremendous amount of difficulty finding adequate prices to support even modest development. And then, of course, they asked to be able to protect their domestic markets, typically with tariffs, but sometimes with more heavy-handed policies. There were also explicit calls for the redistribution of wealth, that is, actual transfer of capital, of money, in the form of foreign aid. In addition to those demands, poor countries, what we now refer to as low and middle income countries, developed their own organizations to essentially contest the positions of the international organizations that have been established more or less for wealthy countries. So when you think of the IMF or you think of the World Bank, low and middle income countries developed the UN Conference on Trade and Development, which produced an enormous amount of data, quite useful information, but its principal policy achievement was a system of what are called general system of preferences that gave favorable terms under quota to some of the countries that I just mentioned. So you can think sort of cocoa from Ghana or sugar from the Dominican Republic to a certain amount would be given favorable terms for export to the United States or Europe. Again, one of the parts of the story that's marginalized when we talk about the new international economic order were low and middle income countries' demands to change international intellectual property law. So India, for example, led the movement to grant compulsory licenses for printed works and educational materials. At independence, the literacy rate in India was 16%. All of the knowledge, textbooks, research that would be necessary to develop a technical infrastructure was only available in wealthier markets, and very large licensing fees were required to obtain them. There was also a movement to end business practices, particularly with respect to patent policy. UNCTAD research in the 1960s found that 90% or more of patents, largely over chemicals and pharmaceuticals, were owned by European firms, even though those patents were taken out in places like Pakistan and Togo. And those firms didn't then use the patents to build facilities for manufacture in those countries. Rather, they used the patents to suppress the development of local competitors. So the general movement among low and middle income countries over the 1960s and 1970s was to revise those agreements to accommodate development interests. At the same time that was occurring, right? So at the same time that the new international economic order sort of really crested, so think the 1973 Arab oil embargo, or think the 1974 UN General Assembly resolution, developing countries shifted their priorities in terms of what was required for development. And there's some disagreement as to the origins of this shift, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But instead of trying to mimic sort of the development trajectories of Europe or North America, developing countries started paying attention to the poorest of their citizens, right? So they started developing primary healthcare facilities that offered essential medicines and vaccines, measures to protect public health. They invested more in literacy and human capital with special emphasis on women, food security, and focused on the unmet needs of the poorest 40% of their population. This culminates in the Millennium Development Goals, and I don't believe that the importance of the Millennium Development Goals can be overstated. To some extent, they matter because they shaped the giving perspective of important funders later on, like the Global Fund for AIDS, Malaria, and Tuberculosis, or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but they also established that development should be measured by a set of fundamental metrics about what it meant for a human being to be alive and to be integrated into society, as opposed to metrics like technology transfer or hard currency accounts. Over this period, even though developing countries tried very hard to change international intellectual property law, it coincided at a time when firms in Europe and North America started being concerned about their own international competitiveness. And they started focusing on a form of intellectual property that had been to that point pretty peripheral, and that was trademarks. So think counterfeit Marlboros, or think cheap electronics from Korea. Which at that point was not the economic powerhouse that it is now. So they argued that international intellectual property law didn't need to be weaker, it needed to be stronger. And the general system of preferences that I alluded to earlier was used by those governments to essentially force a bargain, right? That bargain was TRIPS, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property, which is part of the World Trade Organization. TRIPS created a floor for intellectual property rights worldwide. So even though you had lots of countries, approximately 40, that didn't grant patents at all on pharmaceuticals, after TRIPS they were all required to. Moreover, TRIPS set the floor for future agreements. Over the 1980s, bilateral investment and trade treaties accelerated. There are now more than 3,000 of them. Some of them have much stronger terms than TRIPS even contemplated. They are overwhelmingly between one poor country and one rich country. You also had TRIPS as the basis for other multilateral investment, trade, and IP treaties with stronger enforcement mechanisms, like the Anti-Counterfeit Trading Agreement and the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which, notwithstanding U.S. withdrawal after Trump's election, is proceeding with the countries that had negotiated it over the decade before. So if we stop here, those who argue that the new international economic order achieved little or nothing, they look like they're correct, right? It looks like there isn't a path for low and middle income countries to really ever get the better part of an IP bargain. It looks like IP protections will continue to work in favor of firms based in Europe and North America. My central argument is that is not true once you start looking at the treaties that were developed in the context of basic human needs, right? In other words, developing countries, low and middle income countries, used treaties outside the nominally economic sphere to redistribute wealth, to regulate firms, and to raise their development profiles. So this is all based on a paper that became a book. I'm not going to go over all of the agreements that I cover in the book, but I'm going to cover the most important ones that are health related. So over the 1960s and 1970s, developing countries noticed that rates of breastfeeding in the first 6 months of life plummeted. And they identified the reason as being the promotional activities, importantly trademarks, undertaken by big, essentially pharmaceutical firms, but also consumer products firms like Abbott and Nestle. And I think it's worth stopping just for a minute, because I know this issue can get a little bit sort of contentious in the rich country context. In rich countries, there's very little evidence, and it is contested, that there are any kind of outcome differentials for breastfed versus formula-fed infants, right? Once you go to poor countries, there's overwhelming evidence that that is not the case. And that's because using formula requires being able to read a label, it requires clean water, and it requires the resources to be able to do so and not essentially dilute the mixing, right? So using formula in poor countries can and was deadly to infants in ways that would not be true in rich countries. So the 1981 International Code on the Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes effectively allowed poor countries to prohibit the use of trademarks that implied the superiority of anything but exclusive breastfeeding in the first 6 months of life. Shortly after TRIPS, the extent of the HIV/AIDS crisis in Africa became clear. By 1998, the millions of people, South Africa became the home to the largest absolute number of people living with HIV/AIDS. It was in the millions. The necessity for the government to be able to distribute antiretrovirals was crucial. The 2001 Doha Declaration on TRIPS and the Public Health effectively allowed Brazil, India, and Thailand to leverage down the cost of antivirals by 90 to 95%. And not only did it do that, but it also facilitated the technology transfer to those countries to be able to manufacture those medicines themselves, which those three countries plus South Africa now do. The 2001 International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources, and I know I haven't really talked about the sort of agriculture and nutrition part of it, but a similar dynamic was at work, where you had the increasing assertion of intellectual property rights over seeds, established a centralized system through which the major agricultural firms couldn't extract seeds and then patent them anymore. If they extracted seeds or plant genetic resources, they had to pay, and they could not take out intellectual property rights on that which they had withdrawn. The 2005 Framework Convention on Tobacco Control authorized the prohibition of tobacco trademarks. It's just important to note on the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control that after governments in wealthier countries started really regulating tobacco, primarily through tax, but also through other measures, the overwhelming amount of promotional activity went to developing countries. 80% of the world's smokers are now in poor countries, low and middle income countries. It is a public health crisis, and low and middle income countries have led the way in prohibiting the use of trademarks or substantially minimizing the ability of firms to use them. This is
10 minutes in.
Left?
Yeah.
Perfect. This is Health Minister Suparna Sitty, who in 2006 declared that Indonesia would no longer share H5N1 influenza samples with the World Health Organization-run global influenza surveillance system because, she argued, and she was correct, poor countries shared their influenza samples with that system, and then firms in Australia and North America and Europe would take out the samples. They would develop antivirals and vaccines, and then they would price them well beyond the reach, certainly of Indonesians, but also for people in countries that were much poorer. The result was the 2011 Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework. That requires the sharing of vaccines, antivirals, or intellectual property rights if firms take out samples, which all of them do, from a centralized system. And not only that, but they must pay for the system to work, right? So GSK and Sanofi cut checks to the system to make it operate. You also have the development of a medical research and innovation treaty, even though that's in a series of demonstration projects at the World Health Organization now. The entire idea behind that treaty is that there will be no patents on type 2 and type 3 diseases. And for those of you who don't know what those are diseases that disproportionately affect populations in low and middle income countries. So let's go back to what the new international economic order aimed to accomplish. What I argue, or what I observe, or what I identify in the book is that these health agreements haven't arisen willy-nilly or arbitrarily. They have, in fact, arisen in sectors where very small numbers of global firms control markets, right? So in tobacco, 4 firms control 75% of the global market. In agrochemical products, 3 firms control 56% of the global market. Monsanto and Bayer are now in merger negotiations. That would make that concentration even higher. In influenza, there are only 4 firms that control 80% of the global market. And once you start looking at the actual mechanisms in all of those treaties that I just described, they are regulatory in nature. They prevent firms from doing certain things. They establish terms under which those firms can operate. So if you think way back to the mid-1970s, when one of the objectives of the new international economic order was to regulate global firms in ways that had not theretofore been accomplished, it's occurring. It just occurs outside of something like trade and investment agreements. The other effect of the treaties that I just described is to facilitate technology transfer so that you have the capacity to produce 500 to 600 million doses of influenza vaccine in Vietnam and Brazil and Mexico and Thailand instead of only in Europe and North America that was traditionally the case. So that's sort of more or less the summary of my argument, is I believe that those who argue that the new international economic order ended in failure are not correct. They're just not looking in the right places. Now, I'll say, I don't reach this conclusion in an effort to make a normative claim, right? So I don't know that this is a good thing or a bad thing, but I think what it inescapably suggests is that the question of global wealth inequality will pervade any kind of effort on a global issue. So that includes climate change, it includes things like global management of infectious disease, it includes things like arms control, and I think that we're fooling ourselves if we try to solve those problems without thinking about distributional consequences.
Okay, thanks, Sam.
Yep.
So thanks very much for that, Sam, for setting the stage. That's quite interesting topic. That I want to take one step further, I think, here in terms of talking about a new global order for some of these issues, and that's really talking about existing tools, not necessarily innovation of new pharmaceuticals in particular, but in how we're using them. So if you've been following the news last few years about pharmaceuticals, you might have seen this guy, Martin Shkreli, the pharma bro, noted Wu-Tang Clan aficionado, not a very nice guy, but slammed for this outrageous 5,000% jump overnight in the price of a drug. That drug, sold under the trade name Daraprim, but the drug is pyrimethamine. It's an old drug. It's from the 50s. It's been off patent for decades. This is not a patent issue. What happened here, and what we're seeing a trend towards, beginning in about 2015, was people finding small markets, particularly in wealthier countries, small markets for drugs like this, usually vulnerable markets as well. In the US, where this is happening, Daraprim is used to treat toxoplasmosis in persons with HIV. Whereas the thing is, if you're the only one selling a drug, because there's a small market that you're not making a lot of money off of, you've got a monopoly even without having a patent. That allows you to do things like jack up the price 5,000%. But the way this came about is because the big pharma companies, in this case it's GlaxoSmithKline, that invented these drugs, this right back in 1953, decided that even though they had a de facto monopoly, these aren't sufficiently profitable drugs in many markets. So they divest themselves of that drug. They say, we're not interested in manufacturing it. We'll divest ourselves of the trademark, of the manufacturing license. And they have often done that in a very irresponsible way. to people like Martin Shkreli. And we've seen a pattern of this for a whole series of drugs, often drugs on the WHO's essential medicines list, and very consistently drugs that respond to neglected tropical diseases or to conditions like tuberculosis. So in the US, we saw price hikes. In Canada, we often just don't have the drug at all. That's the case for both of these drugs that, as you see here, won their creators the Nobel Prize in 2015. So at this point in time, if you have a condition, often in migrant populations, for example, requiring ivermectin or requiring artemisinin, you're likely to have better luck accessing that drug wherever you picked up the condition. I was testing this last year. These are drugs that in Zimbabwe, which, as you may know, currently in very much a state of flux. But these are drugs over the counter, $5. They're obviously $5 can be a barrier to many populations in Zimbabwe. Similarly, there are questions about whether drugs like artemisinin should be sold over the counter, but nonetheless, these are more accessible there than they are here. So when we talk about, as you see in the headline at the top, this phenomenal progress in fighting tropical diseases, it raises an interesting dynamic. Often these programs, particularly using ivermectin in very low-income countries, are based entirely on donations. This is Merck donating ivermectin, whereas in Canada, the market is sufficiently small that they don't sell it. So the question is, if in some countries it's not profitable enough to sell, and in other countries it's almost entirely by donation, what is the sustainable method of globally, actually producing this drug? We see the same question with drugs for tuberculosis. Of the WHO essential medicines for drug-resistant tuberculosis, less than half of those drugs are actually currently available in Canada. Some of them used to be, but Eli Lilly in particular divested itself of those drugs. No takers in Canada. They're not available. To get them, we have to treat them like experimental medications that we get from other countries. And we see the scale of this, actually, with a new mechanism that was just brought in last year in response to the opioid crisis to bring in new and experimental treatments around opioids, also some other things like prescription heroin. But actually, the main thing it has been used for is a drug, rifapentine, for latent tuberculosis. To use that mechanism, by definition, it has to be a public health crisis in a Canadian public health jurisdiction. 8 Canadian public health jurisdictions have started bringing in rifapentine through that mechanism because there simply isn't an interest in selling it. So, what are the consequences here of this odd dynamic of donations in very low-income countries, unsustainable markets, unscrupulous markets in high-income countries? Well, we're starting to see those sorts of issues unfold with diseases like Chagas disease, which is the parasitic disease found in a number of countries in Latin America. Now that we've started looking, in particular, in migrant populations, we see that it's also present in the United States. And in fact, there's ongoing transmission in parts of the southern United States, but also in migrant communities in Canada. And we've had to make some changes. For example, we now screen blood for Chagas disease because it has been transferred that way. But up until now, because previously we had not been looking at this issue, these are drugs that there was no treatment marketed in Canada or the U.S. In the U.S., however, this has allowed in the past year companies to exploit mechanisms that are designed to create new drugs for conditions like this by saying, well, there's no treatment on sale in the United States. There is this WHO essential medicine, benznidazole, that has been sold in Latin America since the early 70s. But because it's never been sold in the US, we can take advantage of this mechanism, run tests on it, and start selling it. The net advantage isn't a new drug because it's been around for decades, but obviously an advantage to the company in particular because the mechanism being used there gives you something called a priority voucher. So you bring in a drug for a neglected disease, you get a voucher that allows you to jump the queue with whatever other drug you would like to jump the queue with, a hair loss drug or something that you believe you're going to make money on. You can also sell this voucher to other companies who might have a drug they'd be interested in. So, what do we do here? And I think, coming back to Sam's excellent presentation, what I think is here's where we can start to see models emerging from elsewhere in the world. Like there's the Global Drug Facility for tuberculosis drugs for low-income countries to create a sustainable and affordable supply. Canada doesn't have access to purchasing drugs from the Global Drug Facility, so instead we import drugs at whatever the market cost is from the high-income countries that we import from. Were we, however, to look at integrating these models to say, well, Canada can afford a higher price for some of these drugs, so in fact, let's allow Canada to enter a mechanism like this, but at a higher cost, somewhat higher cost, but one that ensures a sustainable supply to the people who require the drug. I mean, that could actually aid in the sustainability of a mechanism like this, because again, Canada is requiring a lower supply and could be paying a higher price. So, in conclusion, there is these issues of both consolidation around innovation, as Sam pointed out on his last slide, but also this divestment and disbursement of formerly innovative treatments that are still useful, but are no longer of particular commercial interest. And the question is, how do we reconcile these access issues in kind of a global context? Thank you.
Okay. Okay, folks, so we're open for questions, comments, discussion. If you just would like to introduce yourself briefly before you ask a question, that'd be great, and I'll just keep a little roster here. So up the back, please.
Yeah, hi, my name is Catherine Jesse. I'm with Innovation Support Services here at the University of Ottawa. I had a question for Sam, actually. How much do procurement policies in different countries, especially low and medium income countries, how do they harmonize, or at what point, what's the overlap with the IP policies or treaties that you spoke of? Or are they two distinct fields and one informs the other or doesn't necessarily inform the other? Are they distinct problems, I guess was my question.
It really depends on the country. There are very specific episodes sort of in West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa where, the relationship between procurement and regulatory approval is essentially a GSK representative in the room and then a nominal regulator in the room who sort of, talk and not necessarily on equal terms.
So, but when you mean procurement, you mean the government purchasing the drugs for its people?
That's what I understood you to mean.
Because on one hand, there's government purchasing the drugs, and that allows access from the patient to the drug. And you also mentioned the example, I guess the counterexample of tobacco being a problem, or having a high impact on Asian regulations, but the trademark issues is, it's relevant to the company producing the tobacco product, but it doesn't restrict access to the cigarette, right? It doesn't eliminate the health problem. So if we look at the first situation where countries buy drugs to allow patients to have access to the drugs, are there any, or how do procurement policies of that country influence, or do they tie into the IP policy or treatment?
I mean, there are lots of things that come to mind. Whose IP policy? Right. So, I mean, a lot of governments in Africa have become quite sophisticated. I mean, in some measure, because they are passive recipients of marketing by Indian firms who now produce antiretrovirals extremely cheaply, right? So, but you will have transit problems, right? So a shipment of sort of antiretrovirals will go through Amsterdam. GSK will assert either trademark or patent rights or both, right? And then Dutch authorities will stop the shipment, right? So even though you have very strong procurement mechanisms in Nigeria, for example, you have the IP policies of Europe sort of apply. So I think maybe I just need more clarifications on whether you mean in Uganda, for example, what is the relationship between procurement and IP, or if you mean sort of in the global supply chains of essential medicines and vaccines. And vaccines sort of operate in many ways in just a kind of crazy legal gray zone, right? So they are overwhelmingly procured by UNICEF and the PAHO revolving, you know all this. And they are often imported into countries on the good name of UNICEF, right? I mean, so you don't even really have regulatory review in a country like Pakistan, right? It's just that UNICEF has always sort of been there. UNICEF has always sort of supplied the vaccines. And there's no, you might have like a budget line that you can find that you might use as legal authorization, but that's it. Am I answering your question at all?
I think my question, I'm not informed enough to...
Oh, got it. Okay. I'm worried that I'm like not addressing.
But there's a difference, right, between regulation of the product and whether it's able to come to market, and then purchasing the product, which is the, so as the insurer buying the product, and to what extent, in doing so, you comply with various intellectual property regimes. But the whole, what I think what Sam's saying is that there are a huge number of instances where developing countries have actually changed the intellectual property sort of norm or set of laws, or ignored them or gone around them through various means, precisely because they want to supply the drugs to their population at some sort of reasonable cost. Is that right?
And it's even more complex than that. So if you're working with the Gates Foundation, or you're working with Global Fund, everything has required the kind of funding specific checklist that the outside world of procurement policy doesn't even play a role, right? Other than maybe a kind of broad statement that the supplier has agreed to comply with all laws and regulations in the country, knowing that is actually kind of an impossible task. Does that make sense? I mean, I guess your question to me sort of, it assumes, and I don't know to what extent you sort of work on these areas, a level of integrity and consistency and predictability in procurement norms, certainly in Africa and poor parts of Asia, that just aren't applicable.
Yeah, in
Does
other
that?
words, you hear a lot, or I used to hear about, drugs not getting to the people who need them in certain countries, especially in Africa.
Sure.
Why is that? So,
Well, I mean, there you get into the sort of like the market for, counterfeit and falsified medicines is enormous, and so and that's part of the problem too.
Yvonne?
Hi. I'm Yvonne Boyer from the Center for Health Law, Ethics and Policy. And I have a question, and first of all, thank you very much. Those were great presentations. I have a question for you, Adam, And it has to do with the global drug facility and why Canada doesn't access it. And if they did, do you think it would be beneficial to deal with the tuberculosis epidemics we have in our Indigenous communities in Canada?
Right. Well, the very short version of the answer to why we're not involved is that it's set up strictly for low and middle income countries, essentially. But the interesting thing about tuberculosis, coming back to the Doha Declaration that Sam had on his slide, right? They're talking about HIV, TB, and malaria. In 2001, we didn't have any new TB drugs. It's only 2012 was the first, and now we have two and maybe a couple in the pipeline. But the first new TB drug since the 60s. So that was kind of an interesting thing for them to be highlighting when we just didn't have new innovations. But in response to your Canadian question, there's kind of two parts to what's happening in Canada at the moment. There's drug-resistant TB and access to a lot of the second-line drugs, and that's particularly in migrant communities. Also some major centers, downtown east side, for example, of Vancouver. And those are not huge absolute numbers, but obviously a very serious public health issue. Drug-resistant TB, very hard to treat. It can, of course, be transmitted to others as hard to treat TB, so you're starting from that point with subsequent patients. So that is an issue. But the much bigger issue is this ongoing and very long-standing issue of TB, usually not drug-resistant, in Indigenous communities. And that's what's kind of fascinating, is we've had this new mechanism designed for the opioid crisis in the past year, but every health jurisdiction is trying to use it for TB, saying that it is, by definition, a population-level public health crisis, almost always highlighting Indigenous communities or, in some cases, correctional facilities, because there has been no mechanism to actually access a lot of important drugs in a consistent way, especially in large volumes. So the hope at the moment, particularly for rifapentine, is that this will be a useful tool to combat TB in Indigenous communities, particularly in the north. But it's not exactly what that mechanism was designed to do. This is being shoehorned in a little bit. So really, I think it's more highlighting that not only obviously is there a problem that we've been ignoring for a long time, but that there's a desperate need for effective tools to effectively access these treatments. So I think it's a step in the right direction, particularly in terms of showing that it's entirely possible to have reforms to promote access. But as the solution, no, we're not there yet. But hopefully, it's a signpost in that direction.
And I'm sorry, I'm just perhaps not quite following the two parts, but so just to understand, these are drugs that are basically not coming to market. These are drugs not coming to market because there's not the population that can pay for these drugs in the first place.
Essentially, yeah.
So when you're talking about access, you're talking about that specific problem, not the problem of, I think what Sam's talking about is drugs that are available per se, but are priced beyond anybody's ability to pay for them.
Right. Well, that's actually two-part. Yes, I was mostly talking about exactly what you're saying, that they just aren't marketed in Canada.
They're not marketed in Canada.
Yes, they're not. They're not approved or sold in Canada. In some cases, they were, but the market isn't considered sufficiently appealing. Essentially, there are also the issues just of consistent shortages of the very basic TB drugs, but we won't get into,
So, but
into
there's
that.
two different kinds of questions, isn't there? So the shortage is a different question from
Yes.
high prices.
Yes.
Okay. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
Hi, my name's Rachel. I used to be a regulatory lawyer in Canada. And I'm curious about whether you feel there are existing mechanisms that are already available in the IP sphere that are simply not being utilized in a way that could be in order to improve conditions for patients in the countries that you're studying. And I shouldn't really restrict my question to IP. I mean, IP and regulatory really go hand in hand, so perhaps you could look at it from both angles. Are there existing regulatory mechanisms that people just need to take better advantage of, or are there, or various other IP? Like, do we need to burn it all down, or can we use some of the stuff that we already have?
I mean, for the countries that I'm talking about, I mean, I actually think the mechanisms are pretty good, right? So I actually, I mean, to some extent, they got really good because low and middle income countries made these really aggressive moves, right? So Indonesia withholding influenza samples is an enormous, I mean, from a public health perspective, it is irresponsible, right? From an equality generating or equality promoting perspective, it's brilliant, right? Brazil did something similar with antiretrovirals in 1998. And since then, there's been an enormous amount of money. The Global Fund, which is public and private, Bill and Melinda Gates, which is just private, sort of making sure that the supply lines for, a large number of WHO essential medicines and certainly childhood vaccines are available. So I think part of this story that I'm trying to tell is that things are moving in the right direction so far as access to medicines go. It doesn't mean that the system is perfect. And in fact, I think the bigger problem that we'll face in the future is the one that Adam is talking about, which is drugs for which the populations are quite small, right? Where it will be difficult to even get somebody like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to, I mean, they believe in maximizing the utility of the money they have, and they have a lot of it. But things like, Chagas, I would be very surprised if that is a priority for them. But I guess the short answer is that I think things are moving in the right direction.
Right.
Sorry.
No, I mean, I would broadly agree with a lot of that. I think, a lot of the issues that we're facing are in these other questions. Bringing other generic competitors to market, and just some of the barriers that have been thrown up there. The pricing of generics, right? That generics companies. This isn't black and white, that generic companies are the good guys who are saving everyone from prices, as we've seen here in Canada, certainly. So looking at a lot of those issues to try and open up both market entry, but also affordability once we do have generic competitors, and once we do have options, essentially, is also, I think, going to be increasingly part of the conversation. And then, as Sam was saying, what happens when a treatment is a victim of its own success? That we get 95% of the way there, sustaining that last 5% to maintain availability of that drug. Or that vaccine, or what have you. I mean, we're seeing that with polio in terms of the massive resources being put into, the last few, just handful of cases there. But, you look at something like diphtheria, and, what's our access to diphtheria antitoxin, depending where you are. We are starting to see some of these issues emerge. So yeah, I think it's outside necessarily the patent sphere, but a lot of these complementary issues.
David?
I'm David Sweener. Sam, I pick up on your point about how a lot of this is actually working well, and we're seeing something. But you started with slides that were showing the huge increase in inequality, at least up to 92, I think. I think it would help if you also put in the sort of slides that Steven Pinker is now big on, to say what's happened to life expectancy, what's happened to the percentage of the world population living starvation level incomes. The idea, Johan Norberg has written about how many African countries life expectancy is increasing by more than a year per year. At the end of a decade, people have a higher life expectancy than they did at the beginning of the decade. Because I think that does show, some things are working and working really well. I think on some of the drug issues, I also wonder what's the barrier because of logistics, and that keeps coming up in Africa. And the charity Cola Life did I think, a very good job of that, of saying, how do you get essential medicines to people? And we have various NGOs and international bodies spending a fortune not getting it right. They had enough sense to say, it doesn't seem to matter where you go in Africa, you buy a Coca-Cola. So why don't we get them to do the logistics for us? How do they say no? And I believe Heineken has just been suckered into doing the same thing. But also Cola Life with the oral rehydration therapy for diabetic diseases in Zambia, where they've actually done a business model of how do you source enough stuff locally, because you don't have intellectual property restrictions, to lower the cost enough to make it consumer acceptable enough that you can actually sell it to distributors, you can sell it all the way through the rural areas, so people don't have to walk to clinics. It's affordable, it tastes good, it's made in a container that makes the proper amount and it's sanitary, etc. I would see some of that as being really big breakthroughs that go beyond the issue of intellectual property itself. So that as we start solving or get into issues where that isn't the problem, what is the problem?
I don't know if you wanted me to respond. So the last mile problem, right? But I mean the
last 10 miles,
or the last 10 mile problem. I mean, so the partnership between sort of Coke and Tanzania. I mean that's a global fund project, right? I mean, I think that you have the right people with the right resources identifying the problem. I don't. The point of my presentation is to suggest it really is about sort of what developing countries are doing with respect to getting out from under intellectual property constraints imposed in trade and investment agreements. It is not to say that there are lots of non-IP influenced parts to the problems I'm describing. I think that that's exactly right. So, for example, you talk about sort of Coke or Heineken, it becomes interesting because there is an IP issue there, right? It is that all of the value of those firms is in their trademarks, right? And they are enormous users of water, right? Water that probably should be used for something else. But I think that ends up being pretty peripheral to most of what I'm talking about here. So I mean, to the extent that you're saying there are things outside of IP that can get us to better health outcomes, that's absolutely right. And as to the increasing life expectancy in Africa, I mean that what Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, has done with respect to access to childhood immunizations, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if that was more than half of the explanation. I mean, there are really positive movements.
I'm just going to jump in and say, of course, when we're talking about increasing life expectancies, I mean, the emerging threat to that, of course, is things like Coca-Cola and NCDs. So, in a decade or maybe sooner, I mean, the question might be, how do we get Coke out of, all these rural communities that we're trying to get other products into? So, obviously there are a lot of questions about, some of those partnerships and whether it's an issue of, let's learn from the ideas or, working with the companies themselves.
So I'm going to ask you a question about the concept of developing countries, middle-income countries, navigating around intellectual property laws. And I just want to sort of test this idea that that's actually somehow different from what is happening in the developed world, because I don't actually think it is, in this sense that in the developed world, apart from the United States and Canada for pharmaceuticals, pretty much every other OECD country includes pharmaceuticals as part of its public insurance plan. And within that plan, they negotiate hard to a lesser or greater degree to basically, they never pay, what would appear to be the list price that some poor sucker schmo without insurance in the United States or in a middle income or developing country would have to pay over the counter. HMOs they never pay the list price of pharmaceuticals. They're paying something, 1/100th of the price for generics and for patents. So this sort of idea that somehow, I think the context of the healthcare systems, the public and private part of that actually really matters a lot to the analysis that you're doing here, because I would sort of say, actually what's happening there is a product more of the nature of the healthcare system, that there's a lot of private, like nascent public healthcare systems. They might be universal, but they basically cover nothing. And so people have to pay out of pocket, as opposed to in public plans, which are in most of the middle income, most of the developed world, where governments on behalf of the public are basically, they're ignoring these patents as well, in the sense that they're not taking the price that's just offered, they're negotiating hard on behalf of the public if they're doing a good job. Canada's kind of useless at it, just catching up. But they're doing a good job on behalf of the public to get those prices down so that the drugs can go further. So I just wondered, this kind of idea that they're aggressive or, actually you should see New Zealand bargain on this stuff.
Yeah,
that's aggressive.
Yeah, I think that's broadly right. I will say it. You assume a world, or I assume a world where, that all of that bargaining, and it happens in the Gavi vaccine context too, to the extent that they are on patent newer vaccines, and there aren't that many. All of that negotiation happens within the four corners of the patent. Those governments aren't doing what some of them are authorized to do, which is break patents and let somebody else manufacture. So I think that you're exactly right to say, we bargain according to our market power. I think that's exactly right. And patents are a part of the mix. Maybe it's a mix in terms of Gilead saying, I'm gonna start at 80,000 for Sovaldi, right? And then the negotiation goes from there. And if you're the UK, it's a silly number that gets ignored, but not if you're the US. But the patents matter. They shape the negotiation. But I think that you're correct to say.
Sure, but they the price is not the price that you pay. And
Sure.
so but the price is what you pay if you're a sole purchaser, a patient without the benefit of some kind of public insurance scheme. So that's why it becomes so much more critical to avoid these patents, because the impact is so much heavier on an individual patient, regardless actually of the kind of whole wealth thing, because most people can't afford to pay, even in wealthy countries, the cost of these drugs.
Absolutely.
Right. That's certainly true for many of the new innovative drugs, like Hep C treatments, Sovaldi, and so on. Sure, that's a conversation to have. Absolutely. The issue with all the drugs I'm talking about in a Canadian context is that they aren't sold here. So
Yeah,
getting,
so there's a two, that's why I was trying to
exactly.
distinguish
So
the situation.
having universal pharmacare, is great if you have a drug that's sold here. But my concern would almost be that once we have universal pharmacare, to say, oh, but now we've solved the problem. We don't have to look at we don't have to look at this
I
issue
think
anymore.
that's the worst argument
So-
against universal pharmacare I've ever heard.
No, it's not. It's not against universal pharmacare. I'm just saying that obviously it's not the only concern, and it's absolutely important. If you want to emphasize that. But yeah, I mean, we just need to recognize that it's not a total substitute for some of these other issues.
Yeah.
Yes. Would you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Louise Kyle. I'm a first-year law student at the University of Ottawa. Losing my voice, I'm sorry. Hopefully you can hear me. I have a question sort of following on to that. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how policy could, or what the role of policy is in sort of reimagining an R&D system that incentivizes access to drugs in markets where pharma's sort of traditional argument is there is no market because there isn't either the individual ability to pay for it, the government isn't interested in it. So that spoke to what you're talking about with these drugs that aren't available at all in Canada, but also globally, where we see communities that don't have access to drugs because pharmaceutical companies aren't marketing them and supporting them because they'll lack of a market. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on policy and sort of a redesign of R&D system.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are models in existence, right? So CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Interventions, is that, right? So they, sort of got the Wellcome Trust and the Gates Foundation, and I think in part, like the U.S. government, essentially say, we're going to create a fund of $2 billion, right? And we are going to offer you X amount for a therapeutic for a type 2 or a type 3 disease, right? The Medical Innovation Treaty that I mentioned on the slide, right, where, I mean, that would be an international treaty, so it would bind member states and say, look, for diseases that disproportionately people who, I mean, as Colleen is basically talking about, people who cannot pay out of pocket for anything, right? You will not get a right to exclude others from this, right? You will get a check that is your research costs subject to audit because we know you're going to lie about them, and plus 10% or plus 20%, right? So I think those models exist. I mean, and I mean, as a matter of fact, I think that's more or less what sort of Colleen's describing, and sort of just the bargaining force of the purchaser can be one, but you can also just say, the whole idea of giving an inventor a 20-year monopoly is archaic, right? It made sense in 1820 when we didn't really have a good way to sort of track these things and gather data about their cost and benefit, but now we do, right? It is silly.
Yeah, just to add on to that very briefly, I mean, I agree with what Sam's saying, but there's also the kind of the sustainability argument in terms of setting up potentially a viable market. You get things like MSF turning down the pneumonia vaccine donation recently because you also don't want a system that relies entirely on the benevolence of a company to say, well, we're going to give you this for free for X number of years necessarily. To create some sort of mechanism that can actually keep things going and keep things accessible and not focus only on, well, you're poor enough that you qualify for this. If you're just above that, we don't have a mechanism for you, and so on, kind of up the chain.
Mia, do you want to just introduce yourself, Amir?
Yeah, sure. Amir Atarin, professor here. I want to challenge you on this thinking that pervades some of what I've heard you say, that global trade treaties, the TRIPS agreement, really created a health crisis in developing countries, created a landmark change to the intellectual property landscape that then resulted in inequity. And I want to challenge you with the following data point, 2 data points. That hypothesis that TRIPS is really the villain overlooks the fact that in many countries before TRIPS, many poor countries before TRIPS, they had already provided in their domestic law for pharmaceutical product patenting. So to give you an example, in Africa there are really 2 umbrella organizations for patents. Countries have formed a regional patent organization in West Africa and in East Africa. The West African one, mainly the Francophone countries, is the Organisation Afrique de la Propriété Intellectuelle, OAPI. And the East African one, I can't remember the full name, goes by the acronym of ARIPO, African Regional Intellectual Property Organization, I think. Those countries that belong to these 2 mechanisms, about 40 countries in Africa, brought in pharmaceutical product patenting in the 1970s and 1980s. TRIPS did not become binding on those countries until the earliest, the 2000s, and for some of the countries it's not even binding yet, the least developed countries. So how can you blame TRIPS? How can you actually say that the trade agreement introduced pharmaceutical product patenting that then gave rise to some inequity, when in fact these countries on their own, in their regional organizations, on their own, no outside imposition, brought in that legislation decades prior?
Well, I mean, I have 2 responses. First, I guess it depends on what you mean by on their own, right?
They legislated it in domestic law.
Sure, right. As a result of coordination with the patent offices in countries that were also giving them aid. Also,
These are homegrown organizations.
So Peter Drahos has written an entire book about why you had strong pharmaceutical patents in countries where it didn't make sense. And it is not, at least as he tells it, and I regard it as a credible work, because they sort of thought it was a good idea. But my second response would be, in countries where there's little or no capacity to make it matter, who cares, right? What matters is India. What matters is Brazil, right? What matters is countries that have the technological capacity to actually make cheap medicine. So that, if Burkina Faso joined, one of these organizations in 1972, I find that of little sort of import to the question.
But Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, would you say the same thing? I wouldn't.
Well, I mean, I don't know what the requirements of the organizations are. I mean, certainly South Africa, the whole point of South Africa's measures in 1994 was that patents were obstructing access to antivirals.
And that proved to be false. Let me tell you why. The pharmaceutical industry...
we've got another question up the back,
Yeah,
so
I'll be quick.
Okay.
Yeah. Look, the South Africans were masterful at making it seem that patents were standing in the way of access to treatment. It was complete nonsense. They were able to paint that picture because the pharmaceutical companies were beyond stupid in how they litigated against South Africa. A group of 30-odd pharmaceutical companies did sue against South Africa's compulsory licensing law, and the respondent they named was Nelson Mandela. Rule number 1, don't sue Nelson Mandela. They violated that rule. And so the South Africans demonized the companies, appropriately enough, for being so cack-handed as this. But literally the day that the companies withdrew the lawsuit, the South African health minister, inside of an hour, on the courthouse steps, said, "We are not going to bring in AIDS treatment anyway." And they needed to be forced by civil society that about 3 or 4 years later did sue them for access to nevirapine for vertical transmission of HIV. How can you blame the patent system for this when the lawsuit's out of the way and the health minister herself says we're not going to treat?
Well, you certainly can't look to me to say that there was no political posturing with sort of the 15A measures. Fair enough. But I don't know that the sort of the point that I'm trying to make necessitates a 100% relationship between TRIPS and a public health crisis, right? So I freely concede that South Africa, and I mean, it's even more difficult because the whole idea of what HIV/AIDS was and how it should be contained under Mbeki changed, right? And changed in these really pernicious and, crazy ways. So it's a complicated answer to your question. But I don't have any real doubt that there is a relationship between, and so for the 40 countries that didn't have pharmaceutical patents, right, they were prohibited, right, there you have major producers, right, there you have countries that matter for purposes of having inexpensive medicines worldwide.
Okay. Did you want to comment at all? I don't.
No. I'll leave Amir to.
Sir,
say.